At the May gathering of the Presbytery of Philadelphia, we hosted several brief presentations playfully titled Thinking on the Edges. These talks explored how various church leaders are being used as transforming agents in their congregations and communities, leading from the edges of innovation and possibility. The edges of ministry creativity look different for all of us. Hear now what the edges of church ministry look like as Reverend Rebecca Blake and Reverend Karen Rohrer of the Word at Beacon, a new worshiping community in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia, reflect on community outreach and faith formation through the arts.
At Beacon, our initial questions had an awful lot to do with space. We started out that ministry with Karen and Becca and a space. And we were wondering what space has to do with the gospel and how space can serve the gospel. I have heard over and over and over that the saints and the Holy Spirit comprise the movement that we know as church, and that it is not necessarily the building. But what we had was a building. So how can space matter? How can it foster the gospel? How can it comfort? How can it bear burdens and care and share and love and welcome and challenge? How can space really facilitate what God is calling us to do?
We were thinking about these questions of space, and we started thinking about two kinds of space. Physical space, the building and the yard itself, and social space, the kind of space that happens within a community. How can we make a space that is safe, that offers a wide welcome to all people, that makes community kind of grow up in real and authentic ways? So first we focused on the physical space. We collaborated with groups of volunteers from churches and youth groups to completely transform that basement room into a bright art studio with just a bit of plaster and paint and a lot of sweat equity. We made that room into a very bright space with lots of color and art around the room, places for reading and for writing, places to really connect and create something new and beautiful. As we became, as that space was kind of solidified, we moved upstairs and looked at our sanctuary. We took out the overwhelming red carpet that is very predominant in almost every church I've ever been to. So we took that out to make it a more pleasing aesthetic space. We put our pews on locking casters so that they could move around the room at will, and we arranged them in the round so we could see faces as we worshiped together. The biggest transformation of that space was the Lights on Cumberland Street project, which is an art installation made of light bulbs hanging at different heights from the ceiling. It was a crowd-funded and crowd-supported endeavor. Each and every light bulb is meant to honor and commemorate a person who was a light in the life of the people who gather at Beacon and our friends outside of Beacon. There's close to 200 lights in our sanctuary, and that itself has been such an important symbol for us as a message to the community that Beacon is a place that is able to gather light in, but not to hold it or put it under that bushel, but to let it shine back out into the world. As our physical space became a bit more steady and secure, we turned to that social space I was talking about. How can we make our programs, our after-school programs, a safer emotional space for the children that we encounter? There is a local nonprofit named Build a Bridge that does a lot of excellent work in education and trauma-informed care. So they meld education and the arts and trauma-informed care to increase academic performance, to increase community development. We learned a lot from them and implemented those changes into our programs. So as we implemented more rituals, like opening and closing rituals, check-in, going over our community safety agreement every time we have our program, the space that opened up in there was amazing. The trust that was able to be built was remarkable. So now, after almost 4 years of trust building, people find themselves walking through the doors of Beacon whenever they're open, and they bring their complete and whole selves into that room. The joy and the pain, the frustrations and the excitement. Wherever they're coming from, their real, authentic selves kind of find themselves at our doorstep. And it's a pretty exciting way to encounter them and to love and love well.
One of those stories is a young boy who was about 6 years old, who was a part of our program for a long time, and he'd been absent for several months. We had called his mom, we had left messages, and we hadn't heard anything. And early this spring, he returned. And he was really quiet, and he came in, and he he grabbed my hand and pulled me over to one of the story stations and said, I need to tell you something. My dad died. And I took a deep breath and I said, okay, well, we can talk about that and we can write about that too. And it was writing day in our program, which means that every student has a little space where they are able to write. We took him over to the writing station, and in the course of our story that day, he wrote about his dad. Part of our community rhythm, like Becca discussed from Build a Bridge, is this invitation to share what you've created and what you've written. And so we had a share time, and I asked him before we got there, do you think that you're going to want to share this story? He said, yes, I do want to share my story. We got to share time, and he shared his story, and I was struck immediately by the follow-up ritual, which is everyone who shares your story gets 2 questions asked. Mm-hmm. And he was now going to have to field questions about the passing of his dad. And I got worried, and I thought about the community agreement, and I centered myself, and I said, okay, well, let's take questions. And he picked the most outspoken and sometimes difficult little girl, who's about 9, and my heart caught a little bit in my throat. And I remembered, though, that even if she fights us a little bit on the rules, she is one who knows the mission of Beacon very, very well. She's been doing this for a long time. And she's also one whose father has been incarcerated most of her life. And so she looked at him across the table, and she said, what was your favorite thing about having a dad? What was your favorite thing about having a dad? And there was this beautiful moment where the question of how to make space and how to create gospel became an invitation. And an invitation not only to him to come in and share where he was, an invitation not only her to be a disciple and to care about someone else, to bear their burdens with them. An invitation to Becca and I to be a part of the gospel as it unfolded in this space. Because the question didn't really get answered, how does this space facilitate the gospel? It just got shifted into an invitation for all of us to respond to the stories that knit themselves together to remind us that Christ is moving in our midst, in that little beacon building with all of its leaks and light bulbs.